Hello and welcome to our last video in our chapter 22 video lecture series. You're finally here at section 9 and we are going to talk about our immunologic memory and immunity. So first we'll talk about our immunologic memory. Our memory results from the formation of those long-lived army of lymphocytes upon immune activation. Remember those memory B and T cells that we created just in case we were to be re-exposed to that same antigen? This is where it's playing a role. So here we could see a primary response to an antigen. IgM is secreted first, and we could see high levels of that initially. Here's 10 days after exposure. And then we're going to start to see a rise in IgG levels. And here is about 15, maybe a couple days after that, when it's at its highest. So we see that there's a little bit of a lag time. And at this point, we are also creating those memory cells while we created the plasma cells to secrete these antibodies, right? And then we get infected by that same antigen again. So this causes a secondary response. You could see that these look very different here. And that's because we have those memory cells, those memory plasma cells that are now able to create these antibodies very quickly. You could see that we have a rise within IgG within 5 days of being exposed. And then IgM shortly rises right after that, not to the extent of G, but it's still there. And typically we are able to eliminate the pathogen with this re-exposure before the symptoms of the disease even develop. Because if we were to come into contact with a virus such as the one for measles, then we would be able to eliminate that virus using the memory B and T cells right away, allowing these antibodies to be secreted quickly, and you don't have the reaction. Vaccines are typically effective in developing this memory part of our immune system. And remember, we talked about an antibody titer. That was the concentration of the antibody within our blood. So the initial exposure can be that active infection or through a vaccine. That primary response we saw causes us to produce the antibody. We do have that lag or latent phase where we don't have any antibodies within our body, and that lasts up to 3 to 6 days, and it includes our antigen detection, activation, proliferation of the cells, and then differentiation and being specific to the antigen it encounters. Then we have the antibody production through our plasma cells to produce IgG and IgM, and this occurs within 1 to 2 weeks. Antibody levels are going to peak and then start to decline. So in this process, once again, we create those memory cells, and we are going to be able to kind of keep certain antibodies around to combat when we get re-exposed again. So here's our secondary response in text, what we discussed. It is going to minimize the amount of time for us to be able to respond. It's much shorter because we have those memory lymphocytes, and we get the antibody levels that rise very rapidly. Majority of that is IgG. So now let's talk about vaccinations. Most of the vaccinations are going to contain weakened or dead microorganisms or a component of it, and it stimulates our immune response to develop memory B cells so that if we were to become exposed to that pathogen, then we can get more of a secondary response instead of that primary response. And we can extend this memory of it by getting a booster shot. We want to achieve herd immunity in certain diseases, which means that we have a majority of the population become vaccinated so that we are going to be able to resist getting that disease to a high level within a certain population. And in this way, we are not passing this disease to one another, and it prevents the disease from proliferating or spreading. Now let's talk about the difference between active and passive immunity. Active immunity is going to result from a direct encounter with a pathogen. So what we naturally have, I'm going to flip back and forth between the next slide and the previous one. So first we'll talk about naturally acquired active immunity. Essentially, it's what we're born with. So we get exposure to a certain antigen. Let's say it's a cold virus, and we are doing things like having our physical barriers in place and utilizing things like inflammation or fever to combat that pathogen, whatever it is. So that's our naturally acquired active immunity. The other one is artificially, and that's through the exposure of a vaccine, so that we can, in either ways, create memory cells that are specific to an antigen, and we can build that immunologic memory. Passive immunity is obtained from a different individual. So when we, for instance, have it naturally acquired, we are passing antibodies within pregnancy or after. So for instance, IgG, we said, was able to pass through the placenta from the mother to the child. The other way we can get antibodies to the child is within breast milk, if that mother is able to breastfeed or wants to breastfeed. So IgA, because this is a body secretion, will pass through and protect the child. The other one is going to be artificially, and this is when a serum is transferred from one person to another. For instance, if you were bitten by a snake, they will give you antibodies to that snake venom. We can also do this for hepatitis C. Neither form of passive immunity will produce memory cells, though. So that is it for chapter 22. Please let me know if you have any questions.